Today's daf is daf chaf, and we'll pick it up where we left off on the third line. Amalei Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is going to argue against Rav Sheshes. And he's going to make a distinction between Hakchasha Sa'idim and Hazama Sa'idim. Whereas Hazama Sa'idim requires Bifneihem, you could only be Mazim, the Eidim Imanu Ayisim if they're present. In contrast, Hakchasha Sa'idim, when you contradict the Eidim and you say that no, this Maisa never happened, that doesn't require Lifneihem. And that's what Rav Nachman is going to derive from a Kal V'chomer. And he says the following: it's impossible to maintain your position that we require Hakchasha B'fneihem. Ilu Avi Kaman, if the Eidim that are being contradicted, Hamukhashim, would be in front of us, U'makchishin Lahu, and the second pair of Eidim would come and destroy and undermine and disqualify their edus by saying anusim ketanim psuli edus havi akchasha. Certainly, Bezdin would accept the testimony of the makchishim, who testify that the edim who signed on this shtar were anusim, etc. V'lo havi meshkachinim behu, and we certainly would not accept, at least entirely, the Eidei Ashtar, the Mukhashim, who say, no, we weren't Anusim, Ta'avilei Eidus Mukheshes. That would be certainly a case of two Eidim against two Eidim. That's called Trei Utrei. And in the case of Trei Utrei, we'd have to put the Shtar on the back burners. Hashta Dil Lesnahu, now that the Eidim are not there, Tilu Havakaman Dilma Havamoti, had they been here in our presence, maybe they would admit, yes, we were Anusim. Is mehemne. Certainly, we should believe the Eidim who are signed on the shtar if they would have admitted, as the Makchishim claim, that they were nusim or ketanim when they wrote the shtar. And even though their hodah is not really relevant because we have a principle called Kevan Shehigit Shuvei Chozu Magid. So therefore, once they sign the shtar, they can't be choser bo. But nevertheless, in a case where Eidim HaMachchishim, that which is written in the shtar, the Eidim HaChasum al shtar could be choser umagid. Because the whole reason why Eidim that are signed on the shtar are not able to be choser umagid is because of Nasa Kamishan Echkra Edusam Bebezdin. But now there are Eidim HaMachchishim the shtar, Anusim Ayinu, etc. Now we have to be choker v'dorish, the Eidim that signed on the shtar, and therefore it's not nechkara idusa bebezdin, and they could be choser umagid. So just to summarize the Kal V'chomer and the logic of Rav Nachman, how could you tell me that we cannot accept the Eidim HaMachchishim, but rather we will validate the shtar, when if the Eidim HaMukhashim were here in front of us alive and well, possibly they would be modeh, and they would admit that they were anusim when they signed the shtar. And even in the worst case scenario, if they would deny it, it would be trade 2 against 2. How can you validate the shtar? Elom Rav Nachman, uki trei lahari trei. We're going to have to put 2 Eidim against 2 Eidim. We have the 2 Eidim HaMachchishim, and we have the 2 Eidim who are signed on the shtar. The Machchishim say that the 2 Eidim signed on the shtar were anusim. They signed under duress. We have trei trei. This is called Eidus Mukheshes. And what do we do in a case of Trei Utrei? Uki mamona b'cheskas mare. We have to leave the money in the chazok, in the possession of he who possesses it. For example, in the case of the malva and the lova possesses the money. In the case of a mocher and a lokeach, then the mocher is called the muktzah. And we're going to apply the principle of hamokti mechavel. If right, you want to take the money out of the hands of the muktzah, then the burden of proof is on you. So that now in the Eidus HaMachchishim case, the Eidim HaMachchishim set up a Trei Utrei, and we're going to have to put the shtar, so to speak, into deep freeze and go back to the Cheskas Marakama, the situation of the ownership of the Bailam as it was before the shtar came into Bezdin. So the Brisa doesn't mean the way Rav Sheshes understood the Brisa, that we don't believe them at all. We don't believe them to passel the star completely. Now, why is it relevant when you say that the star is not able to function in order to allow the lokeach or the malva to collect, but yet the star is still, so to speak, in deep freeze? And the answer is tfisa. This is the concept which Rashi indicates here, that what would be if the malva grabbed onto the money of the lova, or the lokeach grabbed onto the field of the mocher. And once again, in a trade situation, we're going to say, leave well enough alone. And wherever the moment is in any chazaka, that's what we're going to accept. So that the star is still somewhat of a valid star, but certainly the star is not a tool in the hands of the malva or in the hands of the lokeach to use that star to prove and establish his claim and be motzi mamichaz kasa. And now Rav Nachman wants to bring a proof. We'll see later that Rabbi Kiva doesn't understand why Rav Nachman feels compelled to bring a proof. But in any event, let's see the proof of Rav Nachman. Midi dahavia nichseit barshatya. The barshatya. So let's talk about barshatya for a minute. Barshatya was a person who vacillated between a state of pikus and a state of shtut. Sometimes he was a shoteh and his actions are invalid. Sometimes he's a pikeach. He gets, he shakes himself out of that state of shtus and his actions are valid. And the barshatya, zavin nichse, he sold a piece of karka and he wrote a shtar. The shtar was given over to the lokeach, and now barshatya is claiming that the sale is invalid. He wants his karka returned to him because at the time of the sale, he was a shoteh. The lokeach, the buyer, he claims no, that at the time of the sale, barshatya was a pikeach, and therefore the sale is valid. Also betray the amrishu shoteh zovim. We also betray the amrishu cholim zovim. There were two kitos of edim. One pair of edim testified that barshatya was a shoteh and it's invalid, and the other pair of edim testified no, that he was a pikeach at the time of the mechira, and therefore the mekach is chal. Omer Avashi, uki trei lebahadi trei. We put two against two. We cannot be machriya which of the two pairs of edim is telling the truth. Vi uki mamona becheskes barshatya. Barshatya is the marakama, and that's the muksuk. And you want to prove that the sale was valid and force barshatya to relinquish his possession over the field. The burden of proof is on you. However, Rav Ashi now clarifies that, wait a second, how do we know that this karka belongs to barshatya and he has a muchzakas on it? Maybe when he bought the karka, he was a shoteh, and the original kinyan was invalid. Only if there are edim that testify this karka belonged to the father of barshatya, and that generates a status of chezkes marakam on this karka. But in the case of Leslie Chazaka the Avasa, the edim do not come forward to testify that this piece of karka, this piece of real estate belonged at one point to his father, but rather we have to assume that he bought the field. Is Amrinon. We're going to raise the following logic, and that is Kshushota Zavan or Kshushota Zavin. When he bought the field, he was a shoteh, and when he sold the field, he was a shoteh. And if when he bought the field, he was a shoteh, that sale is not valid, therefore he cannot sell the karka because he doesn't own the karka. And therefore, if he sells the karka, the buyer himself becomes muchzik in the karka. He's sitting and squatting in the land, and misafik, we can't take him out of the land. So Rabbi Kiva asks the following question: why did Rav Nachman need this whole story with barshatya and Rav Ashi? It's a davar pashut. You don't need a proof at all, because if you have a situation of trade, the situation is safek, and we know that the halach in safek is hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. That's elementary. That's basic. Then he offers a possible suggestion that maybe Rav Nachman wanted to prove from Bar Shatya that in a case of trade, if the Baal Shtar was Tofes, then Ein Motziim Miyad. But the truth is, he couldn't prove that from Bar Shatya. And let's talk about a case of Karka. There's no tfis on Karka. So Rikiveger answers that what Rav Nachman wanted to prove is that we shouldn't say Yachloku, because the Gemara has in Masechet Yevamos Lamed Aleph a case of trade, and if it's a suffix doraisa, then we say Yachloku. So he proves from Bar Shatya that this is only a suffix Rabbanan and Ein Motziim Miyad HaMuchsa. If it was a suffix Shel Torah, then we wouldn't say Uki Karka Becheskes Morakam Becheskes Bar Shatya, but rather we would say Yachloku. Rabbi Yavo Ein Mezini that say the Bifnei Machish to say them Shlo Bifnei. I want to tell you, Rabbi, I used to teach a series in what I call the Brisker methodology. And I realize now that the Gemara of Rabbi Yavo that we're about to learn is a perfect example of Reb Chaim's breakthrough shita of what we call Tzvei Dinim. Look at Rabbi Yavo. As far as Hazom is concerned, which the Torah says, Vasisam lo kasha zomam, and two Edom testify against the first pair of Edom and Imanu Ayisam, and therefore the first pair of Edom will either have to pay Mammon, or get Malchus, or get Misa, is that has to be Bifneim. Why? Because you're coming to be Mechai of the Edom Zomim. Yovo Bal Ashor V'Yoed Al Shoro. But in the case of Akchasha, the second pair of Edom and Machishim, they're not testifying anything about the first pair of Edom. They're not saying that the first pair of Edom are psulim, or they lied, they perjured themselves, they weren't there. And then I'm asking Bezdin to punish the first pair of Edom. They're just being made on the Maisa, that the Maisa did not happen the way it was described by the Edom. That's called Akchasha. And that could be a Shalom B'fneim, because they're not the Baldover here, the Edom. They're not being judged and being punished. So why do I say this is a perfect example of the Brisker methodology? Because there are Tzvei Dinim, Shtei Bechinot, Be Hazama. Hazama on the one end is Hazamas Ha'edim Hazomimim, and Vasisam Lo Kasha Zomim, the onus for the Edim. And on the other hand, it's also Akchasha. They're denying that this Maisa that they testify about happened. And as far as the Hakchasha element of Hazama, that can take place even to B'fneim. So when we say there could be Hazama Shalom B'fneim, it means the Hakchasha of the Hazama. Hazama Shalom B'fneim, Nehid Hazama Lo Havi, but Hakchasha Miyahavya. Even though there's no Hazama here, but within the Hazama, there's Hakchasha. You know, it's the Edom HaMazimim are saying Imanu Ayisem, and they're being made on the Edom themselves, that the Edom are liars, that perjured themselves, but they're also being made them on the Maisa, that the original Edom didn't see the Maisa because they were with us in another part. They could have been in New York to see the Maisa when they were with us in Chicago. Omar Mar, Im Yesh Edom Sheksav Yodom Yotzei Makom Acher. Who's that? Oshoy Ksav Yodom Makom Acher Michtar Shekaralev Irav Huchsak Bezdin Einem Onim. We're going to undermine the Pesha Osar of the original Edi Ashtar when they say Anusim Ayinu. And the reason for that is because there's no Pesha Osar if we could establish the veracity of this star by authenticating this Eidim, and we don't need the Edi Ashtar to testify in their own signature. But if you look carefully at the language of the Brisa says, Mishtar Shekara Olav Irur, that there was a defendant who said about the shtar that it's counterfeit. So the Gemara's Medaya Karalev Irur in, Lo Karalev Irur Lo. If the shtar that you want to use for comparison, because it has those two signatures on it, was never subject to an Irur, that means there was never a claim against the shtar that it was Mezuyov. And Bezdin checked out the shtar and they authenticated the signature of the shtar and they gave it a henpeg. right? They gave it a seal. If that didn't happen, and it was lo korale irur, then we don't know. Maybe this guy is such a great counterfeiter. He was able to counterfeit the original signature. Now the second signature. I mean, the whole thing is just one long counterfeit, one long bluff. So Rav Asi is being supported now by this price because he says that you need to make a comparison. You need that the comparative star had once a taina on it that it was mezuyaf, and Beis Din went out of its way to clarify the signatures, and they determined that these were authentic signatures. They put, as we said before, a handpick on the star, and now we could use the star for comparison. But if on the other end, the other star is no handpick, there was never a taina of mezuyaf against that star, then we have to be choshesh that both stars are counted. The Gemara now continues to deal with the question of kiyum stars mitoch star acher. Amri nardoi. Is there a possibility of using a comparative star which was never handpicked? Ein mekayim es star lo b'shtei ksubos o mishtei sados v'ushacholom baleim sholosh shonim u'b'shofim. According to Nardoi, let's say the Malva produced a star against the Lova, and the Lova claims it's counterfeit. We cannot be mekayim the star from another star that doesn't have a handpick unless we have two staros. For example, two ksubos. The Baal writes a star ksuba to solidify in front of Adam that he was mischayev to his wife, who's now going to be in the Nesua. And the Adam signed on the document. And now we could use that document to compare their signatures to signatures on a different star, or shtei staros. Two stars were written on the sale of two fields. And the same pair of Adam signed on both stars. So what's happening here in Nardoi? Nardoi's saying is that he pulls out another star with the same pair of Adam. Let's say it's a ksuba, or it could be a star mecher on a sada. So he has now a comparison between that star and this star. But there was no handpick on the other star. But it doesn't matter. Since the machzik already ate 3 years consecutively from the karka, if we compare the staros and the signatures of the stars on this piece of karka, and the buyer ate from the payrolls for 3 years consecutively, and now the Baal Karka comes by and he says, wait a minute, why are you squatting on my land? Who gave you permission to do so? That's enough to establish that Beis Din checked out the star, again, it doesn't mean that Beis Din actually checked out the star. There was no handpick on the star. But since the Machzik is a star claiming that he bought the field with this star also has a Cheskes Gimel Shonim, which is a clear-cut proof that it's his, then it's as if we did a handpick on the star. Because the star is going to support his claim, the claim of the defendant, and the fact that we awarded him the karka means that he wasn't lying when he produced this star. The star is really solidifying and proving his claim that I ate this field for 3 years and therefore I have proof of purchase. Omer Rav Shimi bar Ashi ubiyotze mitachas yad acher. When we said that you could do this comparative shtaros, because he has, right, to compare the signatures, because he has two such shtaros, That's only in a case where he himself is producing both shtaros. So what does Rav Shimi bar Ashi mean when he says "Ubiyotze mitachas yadach"? When could you be Mekayim a shtar by the basis of comparing it to other shtaros, meaning the signatures, to verify the signatures? That's only if the two shtaros are muhzakim bidei anoshim acher. Two different people, says Rav Shimi bar Ashi, are holding on to these two shtaros. Avol biad atzmo lo, if one person is holding on to both shtaros, he's got plenty of time at night, to figure out how to imitate John Hancock, and therefore we're choshesh that maybe it's a shtar mizuya. So the Gemara asks the following kasha: Ma'ishna tachas yad atzmo telo dilmis yufisiyayev is filu, even in a case of mitachas yad acher nami dilma ozu v'ozal v'chaza asa v'ziyev. Maybe the balashtar went into the house of the other guy, he saw the two signatures, and now he's able to imitate them. More answers kuli alma kuli hai lo matzi mechavik. If a man is holding on to two shtaros with those same signatures on it, he can take his time and he can learn how to imitate those two signatures and forge it. But if, on the other end, they're biyad acher and he has to go over to that guy's house and try to learn how to imitate the signatures, his friend is going to throw him out. We now start an interesting sugya. Now, obviously, when a person testifies in a beis din, he has to remember the story that he's testifying in. But what happens if he wrote it in his own ledger, his own diary? Do you keep a diary? No, I don't also keep a diary. But during certain times of my life, I used to keep a diary. Probably when I was in high school or something. So the man looks in his diary. Oh, now I can testify. I saw it in my own handwriting. Person writes down in a diary, a ledger, and many years go by, and he can testify many years later based on looking at his ksav and what he wrote down. If he's testifying just on the basis of what he sees in the shtar, but he really doesn't remember all the details, then that's called mipiyam v'lo mipi chsava. Edus cannot be based on what you write down. He's got to remember it. But Rabbi Yochanan Omar, afal pi shein zochra me'atzmo, as long as he reads the shtar that's written in his own handwriting, and he reminds himself of the story that happened, then he can testify based on his memory. Every memory needs a device, an encounter, to trigger off that memory. And in this case, he saw his own writings and his own signature, and it triggered off a memory. But now he remembers, and he can testify. He says in the footnote here, in the name of Rashi, he writes, there are many, many different details of the story, critical details. And if he doesn't remember those, he can't testify, because that's again, mipiyam v'lo mipi tzama. There are two witnesses that saw Edus. One of them forgot the Edus. The other one could remind him. We're not going to be afraid that since he heard from another guy, the other aide, his co-aide, hey, do you remember how we saw Ruvain borrowing 1,000? So he's going to be influenced by what he hears from the other guy. No, we're not worried about it. Iboiluhu, but atzmo man. What happens if the Baldin himself reminds him? Can you testify based on the memory that you have that was stimulated by the Baldin? Maybe we should be choshesh that he really doesn't remember the details of his edus, but he's relying on the Baldin. I think the concept of Baldin here is the Balashtar, which would be the Malva in the case of Alfa, the Lokeach in the case of a Mecher. So the Edim met up with Ruvain. We'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain is the Lokeach or the Malva. And Ruvain says to the Edim, look, do you remember that I lent $1,000 to so-and-so? Oh, yeah, we remember. They really don't remember. But it's kind of embarrassing. Nobody wants to admit that they forgot. And on this, we have Machlok Shin Rav Chaviva and Mar B'Dreivash. Rav Chaviva Amar Afilu Ma'atzmo. Even if the Baldover who wants to be Tobel with the Shtar reminds the Edim of their Edus, okay? And Mar B'Dreivash Omar Atzmo Lo. According to the second opinion, is Rav Moshe teaching the same group? Is there a head-on collision? Sorry. Okay, so according to Marbrei B'Ravashi, if the Baldin is going to remind the Edim of all the details, that's a no-go, because then we think it's going to somehow influence the Edim to testify. The Gemara says, La'alocha, atzmo lo. They cannot testify based on the Baldin who stimulated, so to speak, their memory. And we paskin like Mar Breder Avashi. However, let's just turn for a second to the Avchafa Midbeis. V'itzumi Rabbananhu afilu atzmo. However, there's an exception to the rule. If the aid who forgot his aidus and his memory was stimulated, and this aid is a Talmud Chacham, we have a chazak about a Talmud Chacham that he would never do anything that's not halachically, legally moral and upstanding. He probably remembers it very, very well. And where we find something similar, we find it in Tvias Ayin, in Elum Etzias, that normally you can't return an object to someone who claims that he lost it, unless he brings Simonim. But in a case of a Tzur Mirabanan, he says, I recognize the object, it's mine, and we return it to him based on his statement. We're not choshish that he may have lied.